Hello, Modus. We're going to finish off the Imperialism lecture today with picking up where we left off. If you remember, the United States had become a world power. If you look at this map, you'll remember all the different places where the United States was either owned, controlled, or and had also intervened in the first part of the 20th century. Want to pick up with the last thing that we talked about was the idea of anti-imperialism. The Anti-Imperialist League had started putting out articles and was trying to lobby support to stop taking over the Philippines. Sadly, that will not work. But now we'll pick up where we left off, and the first thing I want to talk about are the imperialist presidents. If you look on this map, you'll see out of the four imperialist presidents that we talk about, the first one being McKinley, which you saw in the last political cartoon. The next three are actually the three progressive presidents that we mentioned in Chapter 9. Here they are, Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. So again, the three progressive presidents from Chapter 9 are also the three big imperialist presidents as well. So let's take a moment and talk about the three imperialist presidents. In this political cartoon from the time period, you see Teddy Roosevelt in his new role. If you take a look down at the bottom, you'll see what his new role is. Do you know what a constable is? Some of you might be familiar with that phrase. If you're not familiar with a constable, I bet you can figure it out from his outfit. A constable is a policeman. And here you see Teddy Roosevelt, the world policeman, as he essentially straddles what? Here we see him straddling the two hemispheres. You have Europe on the right, and the Western Hemisphere here, or the rest of the world here on the left. So I want to talk about Teddy Roosevelt's Roosevelt corollary, or as it's sometimes known, big stick diplomacy. It gets its name from Teddy Roosevelt's idea that he said his foreign policy consisted of the phrase, "Speak softly but carry a big stick." And here you see there's his big stick right there. So let's talk about Teddy Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy. Using the fame that he gained in the Spanish-American War as the leader of the Rough Riders, Teddy Roosevelt came home a war hero, even though, if you recall, the real heroes of the Spanish-American War were not the Rough Riders. They were the African-American soldiers in the 9th and 10th Cavalries, the so-called Buffalo Soldiers. I want to remember that, okay? But it didn't matter because he had propaganda on his side, and everybody remembered the Rough Riders, and it allowed him to get on the Republican ticket. Everybody loved him. He became the vice president, and bam, William McKinley ended up being assassinated by an anarchist, no less. This kind of crazy anarchist ends up shooting William McKinley. And because of that, Teddy Roosevelt becomes the youngest president in American history. Not the youngest elected, but the youngest president. He immediately shows his imperialist tendencies. He issues what's called the Roosevelt Corollary, not coronary, corollary. A corollary is an addition to something. So this time it's an addition to the Monroe Doctrine. If you remember the Monroe Doctrine from 8th grade history, it said that basically the United States is anything that happens in the Western Hemisphere, we reserve the right to intervene if it affects us. Well, his addition to the Monroe Doctrine was the United States will act as an international police force in Latin America to protect, you guessed it, American interests and safety. Now, here's the big deal here. We get to decide what's in our interests. And basically, anything that happens in Latin America or the Western Hemisphere affects us, we decide. So while the whole time he says European nations need to stop warring with each other, they need to start making peace with each other, European nations are crazy, man. The whole time he keeps saying stuff like this, he doesn't mind using force in Latin America. For instance, he helps overthrow the Colombian government so that the United States can build the Panama Canal there. Why? Because Colombia controlled Panama. He doesn't actually, just so we're clear, he doesn't actually use force himself. He just sends U.S. forces, a naval fleet, off the coast of Colombia and points their guns at the Colombian, at a bunch of Colombian government buildings, aims them there, and basically says, "Hi, see us?" And you should kind of listen to the Panamanians right now. At which point the Panamanians say things like, "We're independent." And the Colombians take a look at all these big warships that are off their coast, and then they look at the Panamanians and listen to them and say, "Okay, fine, you're independent." So technically speaking, we don't actually use force, we just aid their coup d'etat. That's kind of key, okay? So he can't actually say that he helped them overthrow their government, or he didn't use troops to overthrow their government. He just, shall we say, helped them obtain independence by forcing the Colombians to listen to them. It's kind of tricky, but it's that whole speak softly and carry a big stick. He didn't use the stick, he just held it up and said, "See this stick?" It was the threat of violence. Okay? He's kind of acting like a bully, but not actually doing any real punching with it or hitting with the stick. Right? It worked. But if you were Colombia, you really didn't like it. If you were the Panamanians, you loved it. Alright, so we move from Latin America, though. We're going to briefly look at something. We need to move across the ocean and look at China. I want to briefly talk about China because before we do, we need to consider something. We need to examine an idea called spheres of influence. Spheres of influence. China at this point still was a very large country, just like it is today, but China had ceased being a powerful country and was now being controlled by a bunch of Western European countries. Those countries had managed to get China, the Chinese emperor or empress, to agree to a policy called spheres of influence. And here's how it worked. What they basically said was the only people that can trade in certain areas are certain countries. So for instance, if up here in this region, the only people who could trade up here are Russians. The only people who can trade here are Japanese. Over here, this is all Portuguese. Portugal reserves the right to trade any place that you see here. By the way, if a British person tries to trade here and they're caught, it's against the law, and the Portuguese can take their stuff and put them in jail. This part right here, this is the only place that Germans are allowed to buy and sell goods and trade. This is the place where the British are allowed to sell and trade stuff. And over here. Down here, this is another little place where Japanese are allowed to sell and trade stuff. And this is where the French are allowed to sell and trade things. All of these places are called spheres of influence. If you try and sell or buy things outside your sphere, other countries, that country that owns that sphere can seize your goods. It's considered what's called contraband, forbidden. Okay? That's important. China doesn't like the idea of spheres of influence. They hate it because it makes them feel weak. It shows that they're weak. They don't have any control over who does what in their country. it's summed up by this idea. In this political cartoon, you see the Chinese dragon. See it there? And what's happened to the poor, dying Chinese dragon? You see the British lion. You see the Russian bear. You see the German eagle. You see all these different animals representing different things. The Italian wolf, the Austrian double-headed eagle, the French rooster, and the Spanish leopard, jaguar, I don't know. All of them have their swords, and they're all trying to cut up the Chinese dragon. But what you do notice, if you look carefully, is see the U.S. eagle. He doesn't get a piece. He doesn't get a piece of the dragon, and that annoys him. In China, because we didn't have any spheres, see, you'll notice that we don't get a piece. We don't have a sphere. Teddy Roosevelt called for what he called an open-door policy. He said because European countries were already there and we didn't have a chance of getting a sphere of influence or an area of exclusive trade. Make sure you understand what a sphere of influence is. An area of exclusive trade. He says, let's get rid of the open door, or let's get rid of spheres of influence and have what's called an open-door policy. Anybody can trade anywhere they want. Well, the Europeans promptly ignored us. The guy that came up with the idea, John Hay, his Secretary of State, everybody just ignored him. All the European countries just basically laughed at him. Well, they were going to continue ignoring us, except that there was a group of Chinese nationalists called the Boxers. Well, we called them Boxers. They called themselves the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, which is an awesome name if ever I heard one. They hated Westerners. They hated the fact that the Western powers had carved up their nation and were basically could force the Chinese government to do whatever they wanted. And so the Righteous and Harmonious Fists basically decided to take back their country. They started they started killing missionaries and killing Western government officials, and they were literally a group of martial arts. It was a mass movement of martial arts fighters, and they just started killing Westerners, Europeans. And it freaked out the European powers. So they all joined together. England and France, Portugal, all these groups came together, and even the United States. The United States sent Marines to China to fight against the Boxers. Because the United States sent troops to fight alongside the European countries to put down the Boxer Rebellion, which was millions of Chinese trying to fight against the Western powers, because we did this, and by the way, the European powers won because we had modern weapons. Some interesting stories came out of the Boxer Rebellion. There were people who thought that because they were using these martial arts, there were people who thought that bullets would not hurt them. The end result, well, it turns out the bullets could hurt them. The European powers prevailed. They won, and we actually forced the Chinese government to accept anything that we wanted. And the result, though, because the United States worked with these groups, the European power said, okay, you know what, we'll have an open door policy. And so because of that, the new policy in China was we will now start having an open door thing. So the United States got to trade in China as a result of this. I have some bad news for you, Modus. I'm really sorry, but it looks like we're actually going to have 3 videos for you. I'm really, really sorry, but I'll try and make it worth your while by having some really interesting stuff in the last video. Fair enough? And I'm putting it out here early. It'll be done by tonight, so you'll have the rest of the week to watch them. Okay? Thanks. Promise the last one. Bye.